So today I'm coming at the topic of sustainability in the past in some ways obliquely, and I hope that you will bear with me and see how I am trying to make an argument for our ability and potential to do better science ultimately, and to be able to actually see sustainability in the past in a way that might be useful to societies today and in the future. So you should hear a little bird song in the background. I'll turn up the volume. Hopefully you can hear that. This picture is of particular significance to me. The bird that you see here is a female house sparrow who is singing to us from New Haven, Connecticut, which is where I did my graduate work. And this beautiful photograph is one of thousands of amazing photographs that my dear colleague and ornithologist Daniel Field, who's a lecturer at the University of Cambridge, has taken of birds and other animals all over the world. So it's very significant to me because this sort of soundscape and landscape is very familiar to me. But it's an opportunity to talk about something from a perspective outside of archaeology that I think is incredibly significant for all of us in the sciences, which is this issue of representation. And scholars in biology recently published, so these are ornithologists, recently published an incredibly interesting study about the effects of underrepresentation, specifically of female scientists in the field of sort of evolutionary biology on the actual topics that we have come to study in the field and on the unequal importance that we've attributed to various topics. And so in this case, the importance of bird song, not only of male birds, but also of female birds, is sort of the central example that they frame their study around. And what they demonstrate in their recent paper, which is referenced here, Haynes et al. 2020, is that in looking at literature on the study of avian vocalizations broadly, there is a close correlation between the attention to what has come to be called female songs, that is vocalizations by female individuals of different avian taxa, versus male birds, which historically received far greater attention. And so there's a close correlation between increased representation of female scientists and the attention to female song. But they also found that female scientists, female ornithologists were more likely to, and I guess in animal behavior more broadly, were more likely to select both topics and subjects, so in this case, female representatives of various species, as their focus of study. And this resonated with me significantly because as a Black archaeologist, I have often felt the sort of anxiety and weight of perceptions that work that I do might be considered me search, and it's sort of a derogatory term that has been applied to work by many minoritized scholars who in some way through their work seemingly address something that is close to their heritage. So in my case, as a Black archaeologist with a focus on African archaeology, is this a form of me just attending to my own kind of heritage and not necessarily making these more sort of objective scientific contributions? So this particular story, which received some press in the media recently, resonated with me on many different levels. But the main point that I want to make here is that representation matters at many different levels. And so I'm going to sort of take you through some of my thoughts on issues of representation throughout the talk today. And I just want to kind of have you keep coming back to some of these examples of how it's not just the sort of need to fill quotas in terms of how we diversify our field. It actually has a real impact on the quality of the science that we produce and on the topics of our study that receive the most attention. And I also have to admit to you all that in preparing for this talk, but also just more generally, given the literally burning backdrop of life in various parts of the world. Here you're seeing some images in the background of the fires and sort of the smoke and the landscape of burning, literally, that's the West Coast, which is where my extended family all live. And within anthropology, conversations about how this literally this landscape that is burning should call our attention to some of the real sort of issues of systemic racism and injustice that are built into the field of anthropology, in which I also place archaeology, although I know in different disciplinary traditions, perhaps archaeology is considered outside of anthropology. And so in preparing for this talk, I listened to a number of conversations that are taking place, and I want to encourage all of you to listen to those conversations and not just take my word for it, because colleagues who are sitting at these tables and talking about these issues are doing so far more eloquently than I could. And so in one example that I would encourage you all to follow up on, the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research recently sponsored, I think this was last week, sponsored a panel with a number of panelists, and the title of the panel was, as you see here, The Case for Letting Anthropology Burn. So questioning really the establishment of our discipline and the role that it has played in the development of scientific racism, but also in upholding the structures that allow for these kinds of disparities and violence, et cetera, to persist. And so I would encourage you to listen to that roundtable panel, which is preserved now in perpetuity on YouTube, and to read the papers that are referenced there. But, I think this is a moment in global events, world history, in which we as anthropologists really have to turn our attention to the roots of our discipline and to see the ways in which aspects of, perhaps the past that we are less proud of as anthropologists still affects the kinds of work that we do. And I remain relatively hopeful. I think that if you listen to some of the conversations that are taking place right now that are pointing to the incredible impacts of systemic racism and these disparities on the communities in which we have the privilege to work, but also on members of our field, it's easy to be kind of discouraged. But my hope is today to be hopeful and optimistic and look at positive ways forward despite the clear impacts of inequality and racism around us. And I'm going to kind of take this opportunity to say that, we are also being, I think, in this moment, made more aware due to the coronavirus pandemic and its many impacts, as well as, the fires in various parts of the world and other crises, that even members of our discipline as researchers are being disproportionately impacted. And so I put myself up here as an example of somebody who has significant care responsibilities, who may be disproportionately impacted by school and daycare closures, but perhaps even more importantly, thinking about the people that I have the privilege to work with, like Felicia, who's pictured here on the right-hand side, who is an octopus fisherwoman from Southwest Madagascar and a longtime collaborator on my team, who was recently the star of a short film documenting the severe hardships of climate-driven impacts on fishing communities in Southwest Madagascar, and showing the kind of multiple intersections of these challenges in terms of livelihood. So both the communities that we work with and our own sort of academic community are really having to deal with some severe challenges. And so this makes these questions of equity and justice and how we go about producing useful and rigorous science all the more important. I think we would all agree that environmental archaeology promises society that by looking at the past, by looking at what Tori Rick and Dan Sandweiss call the multi-millennial experiment in human ecodynamics, that we can draw important lessons, whether these are lessons about sustainable technological practices or lessons about how inequalities arise, that we can draw on these as we deal with today's challenges and ideally build a more sustainable future. And Teresa's upcoming talk, as well as Irina's upcoming talk, are going to show the amazing potential of archaeology to see into the past how people interacted with their environment in ways that really can provide us with usable information. And so I want to take this moment to really underscore the value of the work that so many colleagues are doing in environmental archaeology. And we claim, and rightly so, that archaeology has this incredible breadth in terms of spatial and temporal scales that really surpasses in many ways other the data sets and sort of capacities of other disciplines that are also relevant in terms of understanding these longer term human environmental dynamics. And so in many ways, with great power comes great responsibility. I think that archaeologists have the particular responsibility, particularly coming from the social sciences, and so understanding sort of the complexity of human experience and human life to really get it right. And we have great potential to contribute. Some colleagues have pointed out, and the work of major projects like the ArchaeoGlobe project featured here have shown the power of synthesis now in bringing together what is almost a sort of almost unquantifiable amount of archaeological data generated over decades of work. And so we have the potential now to look at these bigger trends that involve macro regions and even the entire globe, and we can get this comparative perspective. And there's tremendous potential for further work in this area of broad-scale synthesis. When it comes to archaeology and climate change, we all are experiencing the impacts of climate change today, whether it's my family out in Oregon or people elsewhere who are experiencing drought and other impacts of climate change. We know that archaeology has a great amount to contribute. And in addition to just being able to contribute to climate change research, I think the incredible work of many colleagues, and I'd like to point out here Dan Sandweiss's work and his colleagues in coastal Peru, has shown that actually archaeology is not just sort of secondary in climate change research. In fact, archaeology can lead the way in many cases because the data sets that we can generate can at times be the highest resolution data sets in terms of documenting changes in climate, as we can see here for the north coast of Peru, documenting the frequency and impacts and responses to El Nino events. And so, archaeology really should be proud in that sense that we're not just sort of the typical jack of all trades borrowing from other disciplines, but we in fact can lead the way in many cases for other disciplines to draw on our work. And so we can't talk about climate change without talking about the Anthropocene. I think the Anthropocene concept is particularly salient in terms of understanding issues of power and equity and justice that I'd like to really focus on today. And I really like this passage from Professor Lane's paper in 2015 on the archaeology in the age of the Anthropocene, in which he really underscores the political context in which human-environment interactions in the past occur as they continue to occur in the present and will do so in the future. In other words, as archaeologists, environmental archaeologists, we can't afford to ignore the political dimensions of human-environment interactions. And more than that, doing so, ignoring those things, will almost certainly lead to scientific work that is not useful, and in some cases, I would argue, perpetuates harms. And my colleague Jay Cooper and I talked about this specifically in the context of two large island theaters, the Caribbean and the Southwestern Indian Ocean, which we describe as being really the representing the vast majority of the island African diaspora. And so there's a connecting thread in terms of colonial histories and legacies in these two regions that I think is important to highlight, that past injustice in terms of subjugation of indigenous peoples, land dispossession, and all kinds of other injustices have compounding effects that we have to take into account as we look to the present and future in terms of sustainability planning and in terms of mitigating the impacts of climate change. In other words, we, again, can't afford to ignore that communities have experienced these injustices throughout history. And so in the paper, one of the examples that we highlight is the example of Southern Malagasy pastoralists, who in the 1700s adopted this imported plant because it was so useful, they could tell immediately, the prickly pear cactus, which the French colonists brought over to Madagascar from Mexico. And Southern pastoralists dispersed this plant widely across the Southern Malagasy landscape, finding that it was useful as fodder for cattle during periods of drought, but also finding it very useful to create living fences and barriers to conceal their cattle or keep them contained. And also this plant has the incredible ability to create a sort of shallow underground hydrology that actually promotes the growth of grasses and other useful species and sort of helps them to make it through periods of drought. So an incredibly useful plant, but the French, in an effort to wipe out the ability of Southern Malagasy communities to resist colonial rule, unleashed biological warfare by releasing parasitic larvae into this environment and essentially killing off this human sort of co-evolved landscape, pastoral landscape. And so that injustice, which is well documented in the past, has continued and compounding effects today as Southern Malagasy, who are the most impoverished economically on the island, deal with continuing and intensifying drought conditions. And I just want to take a moment, and maybe this is, take it however you want. But I often think as a scientist of how seductive science can be, and that's both an amazing thing and the reason I think we all find ourselves working in the sciences. And I think of experiences that I've had where, science and the sort of preservation and documentation of the natural world have just completely blown my mind, as in here on the bottom left, this example of a gynandromorphic bird, which you see in the middle here, an example of a bird that essentially is half male and half female. And the reason we can often see this better with birds or with butterflies, for example, is that they exhibit a high degree of sexual dimorphism. Males look very different from females. We all know, from our own experiences in our yards and in the park, that birds oftentimes exhibit much more sort of fancy coloration when they are male as a way to attract mates, whereas female birds, are sometimes a little bit more subdued in their coloration. And so we can see more clearly these examples of gynandromorphy in birds, but it may be very widespread. And so this is an experience of me walking around the Natural History Museum collections in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian, and seeing in the collection this, this documentation of gynandromorphy, something that I had not known about previously, and just feeling that wonder at the natural world and at the power of science to inform us about the natural world. But regardless of how seductive science is, we have to, I think, maintain some sense of caution and self-awareness, because we still have to ask good questions. And as we'll see in the other talks today and in talks in the rest of this conference, the scientific techniques and methods at the disposal of archaeologists are just proliferating at a prodigious rate. And the things that we are able to do now using various techniques of materials analysis, of geochemical analysis, etc., were just unimaginable even 5-10 years ago. And so in light of that proliferation and the sort of candy store effect of scientific innovations, we have to think very critically about what questions we're asking. What are we putting these techniques to use for? Who's coming up with the research questions, and who's going to be implicated by the answers? And so this goes back to my opening example about songbirds, but also, I hope you're seeing is connected very closely to environmental archaeology, and I'll continue to speak about this. And so colleagues in 2014 published what I think is a very important set of questions, the grand challenges for archaeology in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And here I've just copied the subset of questions on human-environment interactions. And I would argue here that in each case, these questions have an important political dimension, and these questions and the way we address these questions can be heavily impacted by issues of representation and equity in terms of our theories, our methods, and ultimately then the outcomes of the work that we do. And so I just want to encourage us all, as we're looking at these kinds of questions in our own research areas, to be thinking about the ways in which historical legacies of injustice and modern day issues of representation and injustice impact potentially how we go about addressing these questions. And I'll just use as an example of why this matters Madagascar, which is arguably the place that I'm most familiar with. And Madagascar, I've spoken about this before, so apologies if this is repetition for anyone, but Madagascar is, I think, a really good example of the detrimental effects of a pristine myth, in which this island has been cast both by naturalists during the colonial era and sort of perpetuated today in our popular perceptions of the island. It was pristine, beautiful, a Garden of Eden with high levels of endemic flora and fauna not seen anywhere else on Earth prior to human arrival. And when humans arrive, this catalyzes a catastrophic change in the environment, in which people proceed to degrade the environment, and it's people versus nature that leads to terrible things like the extinction of many endemic fauna. And this narrative, again, perpetuated in part by these political asymmetries of power in the past in terms of the colonial history of Madagascar, has led to what I would call an overemphasis on the extinction question on Madagascar. And so some of you may know Madagascar lost a whole suite of really fantastical seeming creatures, including giant elephant birds, giant lemurs, pygmy hippos, giant tortoises. They all went extinct sometime in the last 1,000 years. And the question has always been, how were humans involved? Did humans drive these animals extinct through overkill? Was it a synergistic effect of climate change and human action, etc.? And these are important questions, but I would argue that they have overshadowed other important questions on the archaeology of Madagascar, and specifically on the coevolution of Malagasy landscapes and people, in ways that now obscure our ability to actually see examples of sustainability in the Malagasy past. And not tangentially, though I'm not going to speak about it very much today, I want to give a shout out to work that we are preparing, led by Heidi Allway and a very interdisciplinary group of scholars, to revisit this idea of the shifting baseline, which I think is critical to what I was just talking about in terms of this narrative of the pristine myth on Madagascar. And baselines are incredibly important in environmental archaeology, as they are in ecology and climate science, because they are the way in which we conceptualize a place that we need to measure current and future change against, whether that's because we need to conserve, aspects of our environment and try to, bring them back, restore them to a former state. And I just want to kind of point out that baselines set up a dynamic that potentially is can be useful, but a dynamic that potentially then pits people against nature in a way that may not be productive ultimately. And so now I just want to kind of shift gears just a little bit and try to be a little bit more positive here and talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing in Southwest Madagascar, and how do I see maybe paths forward. And I'll say right off the bat that I think that there's tremendous work being done by so many colleagues, and I felt completely overwhelmed in preparing this talk today that I wouldn't be able to call attention to everybody's work. And so I hope that there will be some way in which to do this a little bit more thoroughly beyond this talk. But I draw your attention to Leif Mullings, who is a distinguished professor of anthropology at the City University of New York, former president of the American Anthropological Association. And while I watched the case for letting anthropology burn, which was decidedly a very difficult conversation to listen to that I referenced earlier in my talk, I then turned my attention to Leif Mullings' presidential address to the American Anthropological Association in 2013, in which I think she presented a very optimistic view that despite the kind of history and obvious challenges within sort of structural challenges within the discipline of anthropology and archaeology, that there's a lot of potential to develop theoretical perspectives and methodological tools that will be very useful moving forward. So this is a picture taken with a drone of the area that I work in, which is southwestern Madagascar. And as you can see, it's an incredibly diverse landscape. All of the work that we do is really trying to connect the sort of socio-ecological dynamics of this marine and coastal environment with the terrestrial environment, and really think of it as a co-evolutionary whole connecting people to place. And to this end, and I can see already that I'm failing to not talk for too long, so I'll try to speed up here. And so to this end, I present this diagram to help us think through what integrative archaeology is. And I say this because, in my own department, in our own conversations, we were really trying to create an integrative anthropology and archaeology program at Penn State. And so we've been having many discussions about what it actually means to be integrative. And so I'm going to kind of take a couple of little stabs here, but one of them is really to be thinking about landscapes and seascapes very holistically, and to be thinking about all of the ways in which evolutionary processes and historical events work together along with people and sort of these sort of geophysical processes to shape land and seascapes. And I think that there's a lot of room within environmental archaeology to develop more theoretical and methodological approaches, particularly in the vein of the extended evolutionary synthesis that brings together, sort of more standard evolutionary theory with integrating theory from history, ethnohistory, etc., and trying to address this more holistically. And just one example here, although maybe this would have been better placed earlier in my talk, of how integrating different data sets and having this more holistic approach across different timescales, but also disciplinary trends, can really affect the interpretations that we end up with in terms of environmental change or use of the environment in the past. And so this is an example from our 2019 paper in Conservation Biology, in which we argue that if you only consider, for example, in the case of Madagascar's forests, data that might have been obtained through archaeology and modern day biological and economic surveys, you may have what I would describe as a very inaccurate sort of view or interpretation of how Madagascar's forested landscapes came to be what they are today. And Madagascar is one of these places on Earth where people are incredibly concerned about rates of deforestation. But if you take a more holistic approach, in this case we describe it as a historical ecological approach, then and combine multiple different data sets, you may arrive at a very different interpretation of what is happening today and what are the causes and drivers of deforestation on Madagascar. So that's one aspect of integration, is having multiple data sets. But another aspect of integration, as I was alluding to earlier, is trying to get at theoretical integration. And so here is an example of a paper that Tanambelu Rasundraini and myself are working on, where we use a very large oral history archive from southwestern Madagascar to develop a theoretical model of niche construction that can be used for archaeological questions and projects, as well as sort of working with contemporary questions around human interaction. And this is a really great place, I think, to develop this kind of theoretical framework, because we have a landscape in which hypervariable conditions are a constant. The climate and environment of southwestern Madagascar has always been hypervariable. And so we are looking to develop a sort of holistic theoretical framework for understanding how people managed to sustain livelihoods given this context of hypervariability. And so here's an example of us trying to get at sustainability in the past, again, by using and integrating evolutionary theory, in this case, niche construction, with local indigenous and descendant knowledge that is encapsulated by these oral histories and social memory. And so my hope is that this paper will be out very soon, and I will welcome critical feedback on this, but I hope that it's one additional contribution to the broader the broader field that demonstrates how we can work integratively. And now I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking, so we talked a little bit about what I mean by theoretical integrative approaches, and I think it's important to talk methodologically too about collaboration and the importance of collaboration in terms of mitigating past impacts of injustice, and also ensuring that the work that we do is grounded in concerns that are directly relevant to living communities today. And so here we have an example of a diagram. This was sort of a self-reflection exercise that our Madagascar archaeology team engaged in to see how collaborative we really are as a team. I think we are all familiar with working in maybe an academic institution or some kind of institution that may be removed from the actual sites that we work at and the communities that we work with. And so in our case, we discovered that at the start of the Morimbe Archaeological Project in 2011, we were not very collaborative on the whole in terms of our approach. So we were not at all collaborative in the first phase of an archaeological project, which here I'm sort of calling project development. We were somewhat collaborative in the fieldwork phase, and that's for obvious reasons. Fieldwork is incredibly labor intensive, and so you work with people in the field, and that is some form of collaboration. But we were not at all collaborative in terms of analysis here. So this is again in the early days of our work. And we were not at all collaborative ultimately in the output of our work. And so we engaged in this sort of critical self-reflection that was a very sobering exercise for us. But it also made us realize that we have become more collaborative subsequently, so that today, well, this was in 2019 that we did this exercise. We feel that we are almost fully collaborative when it comes to fieldwork. In other words, describing full collaboration as equal power and knowledge sharing. And we are partially collaborative in the other phases of our work. And to me, the gold standard is going to be when we can be fully collaborative from start to finish. And what that means is that in asking the questions, that process itself from the very beginning will be rooted not only in what I might think is important or my perspective on a particular question, but will be a crowdsourced and hopefully more full kind of and well thought through set of questions that will then have a cascading effect in terms of making sure that our output also is relevant to community collaborators. And now I'm going to really try to wrap up here, because I would love for there to be time for some questions and discussion. I think that the way in which we talk about underrepresentation and diversity and equity in academia and in science specifically is still kind of representing it as something that is an additional thing that we can add to the equation, as opposed to having it be something that's really baked in from the start. And so here's just an example from the U.S. National Science Foundation of a description of broader impacts that is an evaluation criterion for proposals for funding from the NSF. And as you can see here, increasing or broadening the participation of underrepresented groups is one of those broader impacts that our work can have. And I would just argue that this supports, I think, the point that we actually need to think harder about how this needs to be baked in to all aspects of the work that we do. And so here are just some pictures of our team in Madagascar, and I like these images because what they show, in my view, is that we are broadening what it means and what it looks like to be a scientist and an archaeologist. And so these are members of the MAP team who all have different experiences and backgrounds in terms of formalized education, and we all come to the table, I think, with an equally valuable set of things to contribute. So I'm very proud of the work that we do. We work very closely with the broader community in Southwest Madagascar in many ways, and in some of our previous publications you can read in more detail about how we collaborate with community members, including not only living community members, but also ancestral community members. We're working very hard not only to build methods and theory that I've described a bit in the last few slides that are more equitable and inclusive, but also to build up a research infrastructure that is more equitable and inclusive. And so here's an example of the development of our Osteological Collection that is based in Southwest Madagascar. We actually have two collections that are linked. One is a digital collection of Malagasy fauna that my PhD student Danny Bufa is building using digital scanning technology and going to different museum collections to be able to scan osteological elements and make them accessible not only to our team but to other readers, but also having physical collections in Southwest Madagascar that are built in the community. And so that means that the way in which the decisions we make about how to build the collection are based in the community, as well as the approach that we take to actually physically putting together the collection. And here's an example or an excerpt of the sort of instruction manual that we put together as we started to build the collection, which includes instructions in English as well as in Vezu, and is designed to be, as accessible as possible to all members of our team. And so I think the final, aspect to be thinking about is co-production and the outputs of our research and how to make those really co-produced, which I think is incredibly challenging. And we were very fortunate to be featured in a special issue of Nature magazine and have a feature written about our team's work in Southwest Madagascar. And we were featured on the cover to make the point that science and scientists should be shared, that scientists can look and are many different things and have many different backgrounds. And so on the front cover, it gives me goosebumps to this day. One of the oral historians in the Mikea forest that we work with in Southwest Madagascar, Remisi, is featured. And here's his picture on the cover of Nature magazine, even though he has no access to any kind of digital technology, and probably, even though he's received a copy of the magazine, is relatively unaware of the impact that this image may have. And he's sitting next to a historian from the University of Tuliar, Professor Chiazonera, who was helping and working on this oral history project with us. But co-production, as I said, has a number of challenges, in some cases seemingly intractable challenges, one of which is how to deal with the fact that the research output that is standard and expected by academic institutions in terms, for example, of tenure and promotion, can often have very limited impact or benefit for communities that we work with. And so here's an example just of snapshots of academic papers that obviously have a big impact for me as a junior scholar progressing through tenure, but have little immediate tangible benefit for community members that we work with. And so again, we talk about this in some of our papers, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, but there are a number of challenges, and we shouldn't, as I think they said during the webinar that I mentioned through the Wenner Grant earlier, we shouldn't romanticize either the notion of collaboration. We should be very attentive to the realities that it entails. And I will end here by talking about sustainability and crisis, and to just bring this up from two very quick angles. One being, during the coronavirus pandemic, there was a lot of discussion in African archaeology about the impact of the pandemic on the communities with which we work, but also on archaeological heritage. And for our team, this was a moment in which we were able to celebrate the very collaborative platform and relationships that we have built, because they allow us in many ways to continue to work, to continue to generate important knowledge, not just generate, but also preserve important knowledge in the midst of the crisis. And I wrote about this in a recent essay that was published in a special forum edited by Akin Ogundiran in the African Archaeological Review. And finally, the second angle that I wanted to point out, I think the point that Ari Karamanika makes in her 2020 paper in PNAS and colleagues make is incredibly important and should not go unnoticed, which is that when we think about sustainability in the past and our perceptions of indigenous knowledge and indigenous practices, and our maybe different perceptions from local indigenous and descendant communities about what a disaster is or what a crisis is, we may run the risk of casting aside what I call LID knowledge, local indigenous and descendant knowledge, in a way that creates more harm in the case of climate or other kinds of environmental conditions and extreme conditions. So in the case of Peru, Caramonica and colleagues described that the differential conception of disaster and response by the Peruvian government and by local indigenous and descendant communities leads for the government to advocate and invest in a very specific kind of disaster response that has in many cases resulted in displacement and maybe greater disruption to local communities' lives. And local communities, and archaeology has the power to reveal this to us, have a long tradition of dealing with, I'll say in air quotes, disasters in ways that are perhaps more sustainable. So I'm going to end there and hopefully have left a little bit of time for question and answers, and I apologize for going over, and thank you again for your attention today.